Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. Today I want to talk about one of the bands that's dearest to my heart in all of rock history, and that is the mighty Sir Lord Baltimore. No doubt anybody watching this video has already heard them, probably knows a fair amount of their history now. They're total legends. The secret has been revealed, and collectors all over the world are totally into Sir Lord Baltimore. I first got introduced to him because I actually heard him on the radio 1970. I was a little teenager then. See, in 1970, I was 13 years old, and I was sitting in my room. I was already a fan of Black Sabbath and Grand Funk and Deep Purple and the like, and I heard Sir Lord Baltimore on the radio, and it totally blew my mind. They really stuck out even amongst proto metal bands of the time. And then it became really hard to find their records. As it turns out, I don't know if they were necessarily out of print, but they had a lot of faith in the band and they pressed a lot of copies of both Sir Lord Baltimore albums. They're very common out there now. And I eventually, about 2 years later, I ended up getting a little mimeographed cutout service out of California, and there was both Sir Lord Baltimore albums for $1.50 a piece. So I got both Sir Lord Baltimore albums by the time I was 15, and totally blew me away. And so anyway, that was my introduction to the band, and I'm happy to say that in 1991 I became friends with Louis Dombra and John Garner and had a great friendship with them until they died. But I'll get more into that later. So let's look at their history a little bit. They met in high school. They were high school friends, and in Brooklyn. And there must be something in the water because, of course, the famous underground band Dust were also teenagers from Brooklyn who were incredible players at an early age. And in fact, Dust recorded their first album. They were still in high school. So there's something going on in Brooklyn. So they met in 1968. By 1969, Louis Dombra was playing in a punk hard rock band called Koala that had one album on Capitol. And so by 1970, the three members, Louis Dombra, John Garner, and Gary Justin, formed Sir Lord Baltimore. And at the time, they didn't have a name, but there was an ad in a New York City newspaper looking for hard rock acts, and it turned out to be Mike Appel, who was a talent scout. And so they auditioned for Mike Appel, and Mike Appel was completely blown away. And apparently, the name comes from a character in the Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid movie. And so Mike Appel named the band Sir Lord Baltimore, and then they got put under management by Dee Anthony, of course, who was handling Led Zeppelin and Humble Pie. So apparently everybody was completely impressed with Sir Lord Baltimore. In fact, there's a story that when they recorded their first album, Pink Floyd was in Electric Lady Studios and heard Sir Lord Baltimore and were very impressed. And I can imagine. So when they formed, they were pretty young, 18, 19 years old, and they got put into Valtone Studios and then eventually moved to Electric Lady Studios. And Eddie Kramer did the production on Kingdom Come. And so the album was released in 1970 and got pretty great reviews. There's a great review in Cream Magazine where he just went off the rails on how great Sir Lord Baltimore was, and he wasn't even that big of a fan of so-called heavy music. And in that article, he described them as heavy metal. And so there's a lot of talk that basically Sir Lord Baltimore was one of the first metal bands and the first time that terminology was used. But I have to say that the term heavy metal thunder was used in Steppenwolf's single Born to Be Wild, 1968. So the term had been around. So quickly they started touring. Their first show was at Carnegie Hall opening for Black Sabbath. So an amazing story that the band's first show was at Carnegie Hall. And then February 19th to the 20th in 1971, they played the Fillmore East opening for Black Sabbath. And apparently there's a quote in Bill Graham's book. he singled out Sir Lord Baltimore as one of the worst bands he'd ever heard, and I guess he wasn't a big fan of heavy rock, but that's a great anecdote. And so they played so by 1971 they added Lewis's brother Joey Dombra on second guitar and released the second album just called Sir Lord Baltimore. And it's really interesting to compare the two records. Of course, the first record is just a power trio, and it's recorded really well, and you can tell they're astounding musicians. John Garner's drum work is as frenetic as they come. He was obviously very accomplished and a friend of Carmen Appice, by the way. And Louis Dombra's guitar work is just ferocious. I would at that moment in time I would put him up against anybody. The solo alone on Pumped Up is just insane. What a great sound. Played in SG at the time, and so the second album they added a second guitar player, and things were slowed down a lot more, and there were definitely big slabs of heaviness then, not quite as frenetic as the first album and more in tune with what other heavy bands like Black Sabbath were doing. But songs like Lo and Behold and Caesar 71 and Woman Tamer are just incredible riffs. I've often thought that Tony Iommi is just one of the great masters of heavy metal riffs. But I have to put Louis Dombra up there. The riffs on both Kingdom Come and the second album are just masterful. In some ways, I find them even more incredible than the stuff that Tony Iommi came up with. And so things kind of sort of disintegrated from there. Apparently, the stories are true that they were definitely into a lot of drugs, including coke. And John Garner often said in interviews that he would practically black out when he was playing and singing at the same time because the stuff was so intense. And that's the other thing to mention. John Garner's vocals are really utterly unique. Even in the annals of the history of rock, there's an operatic quality to him, and some of his screams and squeals are just unparalleled. And so, one of the big reasons I'm just such a huge fan of the band, the drumming is just incredible. Gary Justin's a very formidable bass player. Louis Dombra's guitar work is just vicious, and John Garner's vocals on top of all that, just really an incredible combination. So apparently they floundered for a while, and I think by 1974 they ended up out in California, and they hooked up with people like Kim Fowley, and as John Garner told me, at one point they even considered Michael DeBarge from Silverhead as a new singer, which boggles my mind. I mean, why would you have another singer in the band when you've got John Garner? And he was completely squeezed out, mostly because of his drug use, apparently. And so in '76, a third album was attempted, but the sound was completely different at that point. And so the material laid unreleased. And then the album that's out there now, Sir Lord Baltimore 3, Raw, doesn't bear that much relation to Sir Lord Baltimore per se. Louis Dombra and John Garner reconnected, but it was a completely different band, and they essentially reworked a lot of the material they were working on in '74 to '76, and put on new Christian lyrics and the like. And so, as much as I love the band, I have some issues with that third record, although there is an outtake from it with a guitar player named John Stark, a remake of Woman Tamer that is insane. I wish the whole third record had been more like that. And so Mercury really pushed them. There was two 45s off of Kingdom Come, Hard Rain Fallen and Master Heartache, and most of the copies that are out there are promos, so they really pushed the band. Standard copies of it are a lot more rare. And sadly, Louis Dombra died in 2019, and John Garner 4 years before that in 2015. And one of my prized possessions actually is a promo copy of Kingdom Come that has a promo press kit, and it gives a few interesting facts. When they recorded Kingdom Come, they spent 250 hours uh, cutting the first album, so that's basically a couple of weeks. And then when they were getting ready to tour, they put in 800 hours of afternoon rehearsals at the Capitol Theater in Port Chester, New York, before they felt like they were ready to go. And also in the press kit, it's great because it has a promo from Mercury Records. And I'll read a little bit of it because it's so interesting. Sir Lord Baltimore has arrived. No hype, no jive. Sir Lord Baltimore is here, and so is Cock Rock, which in my opinion is the kind of music the group puts down. The title tune, Kingdom Come, will blow you off your chair, bed, floor, wherever you may be. Other hard music cuts are Master Heartache, Lady of Fire, and Ain't Got Hung on You. There's nothing pretty about the sound of Sir Lord Baltimore. Cock Rock will prevail. So pretty funny. But a couple of Sir Lord Baltimore stories I have is I tracked them down in 1991 and I interviewed them, and I'll post the interviews I did with them below in the links. And it was really interesting having a well over an hour conversation with both Louis Dombra and John Garner. John Garner was still very bitter about what happened with the band and how great and successful they could have been, and how drugs undermined it, and how the management screwed them over. But he was a wonderful person, and I got to know him pretty well over the years before he died. And Louis Dombra, and both of them were surprised to find out that they were legends. So I think they were really out of touch with how much their visibility increased over the years. Louis Dombra, of course, was a pastor working with the homeless down in L.A. Also a very nice, wonderful person. And so I got a lot of these stories from interviewing them. The other story that haunts me to this day is that in 1971, Sir Lord Baltimore opened for Black Sabbath in both the Virginia Dome and at William and Mary College. And I was mere miles away from both those shows and missed them. And I beat myself up to this day, but there wasn't much I could do about it because I was a teenager then. I wasn't driving, and so every time Chuck and I wanted to go to a show, we'd have to ask my dad to drive us. And he'd already driven us to see Grand Funk. He'd already driven us to see Blue Oyster Cult and Sly and the Family Stone. He'd also driven us to see Alice Cooper, and we just couldn't bring ourselves to ask my dad to drive us to see Black Sabbath. And then finding out years later that Sir Lord Baltimore was the opening act. And there's also a great ad that you can see out there online now. There was an incredible show when they played the Rock Pile in 1971, and the lineup was Black Sabbath, Sir Lord Baltimore, and Dust. That's got to be one of the heaviest concerts that's ever occurred on Earth. What an incredible lineup. And so there you have it. I'm glad to say that the members of Sir Lord Baltimore became friends of mine. I'm glad to say that I discovered them when I was barely into my teens. I'm glad to say that they're just incredibly dear to my heart. I just have a special spot for Sir Lord Baltimore because their brand of heavy music was so incendiary and so frenetic for that era, and there really isn't anything quite like them. And in some ways, I truly feel like they perhaps are the greatest heavy metal band that's ever existed. And in fact, if you want to see a bunch of ephemera, I have a Facebook page called Sir Lord Baltimore, the greatest heavy metal band in history. And the complete bio that I just read from is posted on there, and a lot of their music and gig ads are on there. So probably a pretty sizable collection of what is out there on Sir Lord Baltimore. So I recommend it. But yeah, Sir Lord Baltimore, they are definitely one of the main reasons I completely fucking love rock music. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.